The office building was nearly empty that night, only the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady tapping of keys breaking the silence. The man sat at his desk, papers stacked neatly beside him, the glow of the monitor reflecting in his tired eyes. He was used to nights like this, when everyone else had gone home and he remained, double-checking numbers, finishing reports, and making sure nothing was left undone. For him, work was not just a paycheck. It was pride. He believed in doing things right, even when no one noticed. Outside the tall glass windows, the city was alive with distant horns and flashing lights, but inside the office, it felt like a different world. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his stiff shoulders, then saved the final report, filed it, and turned off the computer. It was past midnight when he finally locked the office door and stepped into the cool night air. He drove home in silence, unaware that the next morning his life would change. When he arrived at work the next day, things felt off. The receptionist, usually cheerful, avoided his eyes as she handed him his visitor pass. Two co-workers who always greeted him with smiles turned away quickly, whispering in low voices. He frowned but ignored it, thinking perhaps they were busy or stressed. He carried his files into his office, ready to begin another long day. But before he could settle at his desk, his phone rang. The caller ID flashed HR department. He answered, his voice calm. Yes. A clipped voice responded, please come to HR immediately. Bring nothing with you. His stomach tightened. The words sounded cold, formal, wrong. He hung up, left his files behind, and walked down the long hallway. People glanced up as he passed, their expressions curious, some even smug. By the time he reached HR, whispers had already begun to spread. Inside the room, the atmosphere was heavy. 3 people sat at the table, an HR officer, a company lawyer, and his boss. The boss leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed, a look of fake concern painted on his face. The man sat down, his heart steady but his mind alert. The HR officer cleared her throat. We have received evidence of financial misconduct. Company funds have been diverted into personal accounts. The trail leads to you. He stared at her, shocked. What? That's impossible. The lawyer slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails, financial documents, and transaction records. He picked them up, scanning the pages, his hands tightening as he read. The documents showed money leaving the company accounts, landing in an account with his name attached. The emails, supposedly written by him, instructed transfers in coded language. His chest tightened, but his voice stayed calm. These aren't mine. I never wrote these emails. I never touched company accounts. His boss leaned forward, his face twisted into an expression of mock sadness. It's disappointing. I trusted you. I defended you. And now, this. The man's eyes flicked to him. There was something in his tone, something off. His boss's words were too smooth, too rehearsed, and the faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of his mouth betrayed him. The HR officer pressed on. We have to suspend you until the investigation is complete. Depending on the outcome, this could become a criminal case. Around them, the air grew thick. His boss leaned toward the lawyer, whispering loudly enough for the man to hear, "He's finished." The man sat still, staring at the papers in front of him. His mind raced. How could this be? He had worked late almost every night, carefully keeping records, never touching company funds. Someone had planted this. Someone had framed him. And sitting across from him, pretending to look disappointed, was the man who had orchestrated it all, his boss. He could see it now. The emails had been too perfect, the trail too clean, as if someone had designed it with the intention of being found. His boss had power, connections, and access. It would have been easy to forge documents, to reroute accounts, to set up fake transfers. And now, with everyone watching, he was playing the role of betrayed leader while secretly savoring his downfall. But the man did not lash out. He did not beg or shout. He closed the folder slowly, set it back on the table, and looked each of them in the eye. I didn't do this. The HR officer shifted uncomfortably. The lawyer said nothing. His boss only smirked, tilting his head slightly as if mocking him. "We'll let the investigation decide," the boss said in a tone filled with false kindness. The meeting ended quickly. The man was escorted out of the office like a criminal. Co-workers gathered in small clusters, watching him as he walked by. Some looked away in guilt, others in judgment, a few in quiet triumph. He could hear snippets of their whispers: embezzlement, fraud, fired. His steps were steady, his face unreadable, but inside his chest a storm raged. Outside the building, he stopped at his car and looked back at the tall glass office where he had given years of his life. His boss stood by the window on the top floor, watching him leave. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, the boss allowed the mask to slip. His smirk widened, pure arrogance shining through. He thought he had won. He thought the man was broken, ruined, powerless. But the man said nothing. He simply got into his car, started the engine, and drove away, the silence heavier than any words. For the rest of the day, the office buzzed with gossip. Emails flew, phones rang, and everyone talked about the downfall of the man who had once been respected for his hard work. His boss walked through the halls like a king, his fake sympathy now gone, replaced with pride. He whispered to his closest allies, "He's finished. By next week, he'll be gone for good." The man, sitting at home that evening, replayed every moment in his mind. He remembered the documents, the forged emails, the whispers, and most of all, the smirk on his boss's face. His jaw tightened. They thought he was weak. They thought framing him would end him. But they didn't know his secret. They didn't know the papers locked away in his safe. They didn't know that the man they had tried to bury was the one who already held the power to destroy them. For now, he stayed silent. For now, he let them believe they had won. But deep inside, he whispered to himself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The next morning, when the man stepped into the office building, everything felt different. The same glass doors, the same polished floors, the same humming computers, but the air itself seemed heavier, charged with suspicion. Co-workers who once smiled at him now kept their distance. Some pretended to be busy at their desks, tapping nervously on keyboards, while others whispered behind cups of coffee, their eyes darting in his direction. He could feel the weight of their stares, the sharp edge of judgment cutting into him with every step. Rumors spread faster than truth in places like this. By the time he reached his desk, half the office already believed he had stolen money. Emails were forwarded in secret, private chats lit up with speculation, and the story grew more twisted each time it was told. They say he transferred thousands. I heard he was caught red-handed. Apparently, the police might get involved. None of it was true, but the more people repeated it, the more it became real in their minds. His boss walked the halls like a hero, stopping at desks, shaking his head sadly, whispering, "I didn't want it to be true, but sometimes even the best-looking people hide the darkest secrets." His fake sympathy fooled many. They nodded, pitying him, praising the boss for being strong enough to handle the situation. The man watched this theater of lies in silence. He didn't fight back. He didn't argue. Every time someone looked at him with suspicion, he simply met their eyes calmly, his expression steady. That silence unsettled them. Guilt stirred in a few, but fear kept them quiet. The boss expected him to beg, to shout, to defend himself loudly, but instead, he gave nothing. And that nothing was more powerful than words. At lunch, he sat alone in the cafeteria, the chatter around him buzzing with half-truths. Co-workers glanced at him but quickly looked away when he met their eyes. One younger employee, someone who had admired him before, leaned toward a friend and whispered, "If he really stole money, why is he still so calm?" The friend shrugged nervously. "Maybe he doesn't care. Maybe he thinks he won't get caught." The man sipped his coffee, not responding, but inside he knew the real reason. Calmness came from knowledge, from certainty. He wasn't calm because he was guilty. He was calm because he knew the truth would eventually surface, and when it did, it would not just clear his name, it would destroy the very man spreading these lies. His boss, however, grew bolder with each passing day. He called short meetings with teams, dropping casual lines like, "We must all learn from mistakes. Even trusted people can disappoint us." He made sure to remind everyone that he had been the one to catch the theft, painting himself as the protector of the company. Behind his smile, his arrogance grew, believing his plan had already succeeded. But arrogance is dangerous. It blinds men to the cracks forming under their feet. And cracks had already begun to show. A few co-workers who knew the man well started to question the story. They remembered nights when he stayed late, double-checking reports, fixing mistakes others overlooked. They remembered his honesty, his dedication. It didn't fit with the image of a thief. Quietly, some of them began to doubt, though they didn't speak their doubts out loud, not yet. The man noticed their hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. He said nothing to them, offered no defense, but he held on to that flicker like a spark. Sparks grow into flames when the time is right. That evening, as the office emptied, the man remained at his desk, pretending to review old reports. But he was watching. He saw his boss slip into his office late, carrying a folder, closing the blinds quickly. Minutes later, he heard the faint sound of typing, the quick shuffle of papers. His boss thought the building was empty, thought his lies were safe. The man leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing, committing every detail to memory. He didn't need to confront him now. Proof was building piece by piece, and when the right moment came, he would strike with evidence so sharp no one could deny it. When he finally left the office, the whispers still followed him. A janitor muttered under his breath, "That's him, the one who stole." Another employee, leaving with a friend, said, "He'll be gone in a week. The boss already said so." The man walked past them without a word, his silence heavier than any denial. Outside, the night air was cool, the city lights reflecting in his calm eyes. They thought the whispers would bury him. They thought the rumors would break him. But every whisper was just another thread, weaving a net that would one day trap the real thief. And when that day came, the same voices that judged him would turn on the boss, louder than ever before. He unlocked his car, sat behind the wheel, and whispered to himself, "Let them talk. Soon, they'll see who the real thief is." Then he started the engine and drove into the night, carrying with him not despair, but patience. The kind of patience that destroys empires built on lies. Days passed and the whispers grew louder, but the man's silence remained the same. People thought he was broken, thought he had accepted his fate. But in truth, he was watching carefully, studying every move, listening to every careless word. Lies always leave traces, and he knew the trap around him had holes waiting to be found. One evening, after most employees had left, he sat quietly at his desk, pretending to review old reports. The office was dim, only a few lights humming overhead. That was when he noticed something unusual. His boss slipped into his office again, the same way he had done before, closing the blinds quickly and staying inside for nearly an hour. The man's eyes narrowed. He didn't move, didn't alert anyone. But when his boss finally left, carrying a folder tucked tightly under his arm, the man walked slowly toward the office door. He pushed it open just enough to glance inside. On the desk, the screen of the computer was still on, lines of code and transaction records glowing faintly. He stepped in, his steps careful, and leaned closer. The files on the screen matched the same type of records that had been used against him. His chest tightened. His instincts had been right. His boss had planted the evidence. Quickly, he pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. He had carried it for weeks, waiting for a chance. With steady hands, he copied the files onto it, the progress bar moving painfully slow. Every sound in the empty office echoed, every creak of the building made his heart pound, but finally the download finished. He slipped the drive into his pocket and left, locking the door behind him exactly as it had been. That night at home, he studied the files carefully. The timestamps were clear. The supposed emails he had sent were created on nights when he wasn't even in the building. Some were sent at times he could prove he was elsewhere, using receipts and parking logs. His boss had made a mistake. In his arrogance, he had forged documents but overlooked details, leaving small cracks that revealed the truth. The man leaned back in his chair, his face calm but his eyes sharp. The trap had been revealed. The next day, he dug deeper. He spoke quietly to the security guard, asking casual questions. The guard, thinking it was harmless talk, admitted that the boss often came late at night, using his keycard to access the offices. The man asked for nothing more, but later, when he checked the records, the logs confirmed it. Every night the fake emails were created, the boss's keycard had been used. Piece by piece, the puzzle fit together. His boss had framed him. The realization burned like fire, but the man didn't rush to expose it yet. He knew patience was stronger than rage. In the office, the boss strutted around with his usual arrogance, convinced his plan was perfect. He threw sharp looks at the man, smirked when co-workers turned away, and even whispered again to his allies, "He won't last another week." The man listened, but instead of fear, he felt a strange calm. He had proof now. Proof the boss didn't know he had taken. And with every passing day, his silence became heavier, more dangerous. A few co-workers noticed the change. One woman who had worked with him for years approached hesitantly. "I don't believe you did it," she whispered quickly before walking away. Another employee slipped him a copy of the late-night security schedule, muttering, "I thought you might need this." Slowly, the office was beginning to shift. Doubt was creeping in, and the boss didn't see it. The man stayed in the shadows, letting his boss grow bolder, letting him believe he had already won. But the truth was no longer hidden. The trap had been revealed, and soon the one who had built it would find himself caught inside. That evening, as the sun set behind the glass walls of the company building, the man stood in the parking lot, staring up at his boss's office window. His expression was unreadable, his silence steady, but his thoughts were clear. "You framed me with lies," he whispered under his breath. "But your lies will burn you. I don't need to fight you loud. I'll fight you with truth." Then he turned, walked to his car, and drove away, the flash drive in his pocket heavy like a weapon waiting to be used. The office moved on as if nothing had changed, but under the surface, tension grew with every passing day. The man still came to work on time, still sat at his desk, still kept his head down as if the accusations had broken him. Co-workers watched him carefully, expecting him to snap, to defend himself loudly, to beg for mercy, but he did none of these things. He stayed silent. He moved with calm steps, spoke in short words, and worked with steady hands. To most, it looked like defeat. To his boss, it looked like surrender. But the truth was different. Behind that silence, the man was building something dangerous. At home, his nights were no longer filled with reports and spreadsheets. Now they were spent in his study, the lamp glowing as he pieced together the puzzle. The flash drive sat on his desk, holding proof of the forged emails. Beside it, he stacked security logs showing his boss's late-night visits to the office. Receipts, parking slips, and even surveillance clips backed his alibi. Each document was a weapon, each piece of evidence a nail in the coffin of the man who thought himself untouchable. And then there was the second folder, heavier, older, hidden in his safe. This one held stock certificates, shares he had quietly bought months earlier. While his boss played games of power with lies, he had been buying real power with patience. Not many, at first, just enough to remain invisible. But over time, little by little, he had built a stake that gave him influence. Influence no one knew about. He ran his fingers across the papers, his face calm but his eyes sharp. His boss had tried to bury him with lies, but he would bury him with truth and law. In the office, the boss strutted as if the war was over. He smiled too much, spoke too loudly, laughed at jokes that weren't funny. He walked past the man's desk with fake pity, patting him on the shoulder and saying things like, "Tough times, but maybe you'll find work elsewhere," loud enough for others to hear. His allies chuckled, believing the man was finished. But the man only looked up at him with that same steady calm, and that calmness unsettled the boss in ways he couldn't admit. Because arrogance thrives on weakness, and the absence of weakness feels like a threat. Late at night, the man met quietly with his lawyer. They sat in a small office away from the company building, papers spread between them. The lawyer's eyes widened as he studied the files. "This is enough," he said firmly. "The emails, the logs, the transactions, they all point back to him. And with your shares, you don't just defend yourself. You control the board." The man nodded slowly, his face still calm. "Not yet," he said. "The time has to be right." Patience. That was his greatest weapon. He could strike now, but the blow would be smaller. If he waited, if he let the boss climb higher on his false throne, the fall would be louder, harder, and final. So he returned to work the next day with the same quiet steps, the same calm face. His co-workers whispered, his boss smirked, but inside, he was already holding the crown. And the silence before the storm grew heavier each day. The boss began to notice it too, though he would never admit it. At night, in his office, he glanced nervously at the blinds, wondering if someone was watching. He added new locks to his doors, erased files from his computer, barked orders at his assistants. He told himself he had won, but in the back of his mind, the man's silence gnawed at him. Why wasn't he fighting back? Why wasn't he defending himself? Why wasn't he angry? Fear, small and sharp, began to creep into the cracks of his arrogance. But it was too late. The storm had already formed. The man stood one evening at his window, looking down at the city lights. His reflection in the glass showed calm eyes, but behind them, the fire burned steady. His boss thought silence meant surrender. He would soon learn silence meant preparation. And when the storm finally broke, nothing would protect him from the truth. The man's silence was not weakness. It was patience, and patience had given him time to build a weapon his boss could never see coming. While the whispers in the office painted him as a thief, while his boss paraded around like a hero who had saved the company, the man quietly guarded a secret that would soon turn everything upside down. That secret was locked away in his safe at home, hidden under old files no one cared to touch. Inside were stock certificates, neat papers with bold stamps and signatures, each one proof of ownership. Months earlier, when everyone else in the company had been chasing promotions and bonuses, he had been chasing something different, shares. At first, they were small. A few percent here, a few percent there. It wasn't easy. He sacrificed comfort, saved money, and bought carefully, always under the radar. No one paid attention to him, the quiet man who worked late, and that was his greatest advantage. By the time his boss accused him of theft, he already held enough to have a real voice on the board, a voice strong enough to vote, a voice strong enough to change leadership. He would not just defend himself, he would take control. Each evening, he reviewed the papers again, reminding himself that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, quiet and steady, until the right moment. And that moment was close. At the office, his boss grew more reckless. Meetings became stages where he boasted loudly, waving reports around, warning others to stay honest or end up like him. His allies laughed, their loyalty fueled by fear more than respect. The man sat quietly in the corner, listening, his face calm. Inside, he felt no anger anymore, only certainty. His boss thought the game was won, but he was playing on a board he didn't even understand. One night, the man sat with his lawyer again. They reviewed everything, emails, logs, receipts, and finally the stock certificates. The lawyer leaned back, stunned. "With this," he said slowly, tapping the papers, "you don't just prove innocence. You own part of the company. Enough to call for a vote, enough to challenge leadership. He thinks he framed you. He doesn't know you've already outplayed him." The man nodded, his expression unreadable. "He thinks silence means fear," he said quietly. "But silence means power." Over the next few days, the man prepared carefully. He gathered statements from co-workers who had begun to doubt the story, lined up the documents in perfect order, and waited for the company's next big event. It was coming soon, the quarterly board meeting, when leaders gathered to discuss profits and strategies, when the boss would stand proudly before them, boasting of his victories. The man planned to be there, not as an accused employee, but as a shareholder with the right to speak. As the date drew near, the office buzzed with gossip. Some said he was about to be fired officially. Others whispered that criminal charges were next. The boss fueled the rumors, smirking whenever the man walked by, muttering to his allies, "Any day now, he'll be out on the street." But every time the boss said it, the man's calm eyes met his, and something in that calmness unsettled him. It was like staring into deep water. You never knew what swam beneath. The night before the meeting, the man sat alone in his house, the safe open beside him, the stock certificates laid across the desk. He read them one last time, the bold black letters reminding him that ownership was not always loud. Ownership could be quiet, patient, invisible, until the right moment. He stacked the papers neatly, placed them into a black folder, and closed the safe with a click. The weight of the folder in his hand felt heavier than any weapon, heavier than any rumor, heavier than any lie. It was the kind of power his boss could never steal, because it wasn't built on lies, it was built on truth. At dawn, he dressed in a clean suit, tied his tie with steady hands, and looked at himself in the mirror. The whispers had called him a thief, but tomorrow the whispers would call him something else. He left his house with the folder under his arm, his steps calm, his face steady. For weeks he had been silent, for weeks his boss had celebrated, for weeks the office had judged him. But now, the storm was ready. And in the heart of that storm was his secret power, the one thing his boss never imagined. He wasn't just an employee. He was an owner. The day of the board meeting arrived with tension thick in the air. The large conference room gleamed with polished wood and tall glass windows. A table stretched across the middle surrounded by high-backed chairs. Executives, shareholders, and board members filed in, their voices low, their eyes sharp. For most of them, this meeting was routine, a discussion of profits and new projects. But whispers floated among them that today would be different. Today, the man accused of theft would face judgment. The man entered quietly, his step steady, his black folder under his arm. Some board members looked at him with pity, others with disdain, but he gave them nothing. His calm expression never changed. He sat at the far end of the table, silent, waiting. Moments later, the boss arrived, striding in like a king entering his court. His suit was crisp, his smile wide, his voice booming as he greeted the room. He carried himself with the arrogance of someone who believed the outcome was already written. He glanced at the man, smirked, and took his place at the head of the table. The meeting began with reports and figures, charts projected onto the wall, numbers about growth and expenses. But everyone knew what they were waiting for. Finally, the boss cleared his throat and leaned forward, his hands clasped together dramatically. "There is an issue we must address," he began, his voice heavy with false concern. He looked around the room, pausing just long enough for tension to build. "One of our employees has been caught misusing company funds. It pains me to say this, but we cannot allow thieves in our ranks." Murmurs rippled through the room. Some board members nodded, others frowned. The boss opened a folder and slid copies of the fake emails and documents across the table. "The evidence is clear," he said firmly. "He redirected money into his own accounts. He betrayed our trust. For the good of the company, I recommend immediate termination and legal action." He sat back, satisfied, his smirk returning. Several members leaned forward, studying the papers, shaking their heads in disapproval. Eyes turned toward the man at the other end of the table, expecting him to protest, to defend himself desperately. But he didn't. He opened his black folder slowly, laid it on the table, and pushed it forward. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. "Those documents are lies. And I can prove it." The room grew still. He pulled out the flash drive, sliding it to the lawyer seated nearby. "These are the original files from the company system, copied directly from his office. They show the transactions were created on nights when I wasn't here. Security logs confirm his keycard was used. Parking records confirm my location. Even the timestamps don't match." The lawyer plugged in the drive, and soon the screen lit up with records. Clear, undeniable proof. Gasps echoed as the data appeared, the patterns obvious. The board members leaned closer, whispering to each other, their faces shifting from doubt to shock. The man continued, his tone still calm. He staged it. He forged the emails. He planted the evidence. And while he was busy framing me, he forgot to cover his own tracks. The boss's face paled, his smirk vanishing as the room turned toward him. He stammered, This is nonsense. He's lying. But before he could speak further, the man placed the final set of papers on the table, the stock certificates. The room fell silent. He spoke slowly, every word sharp as a blade. Before you decide my future, you should know something. I am not just an employee. I own shares. Enough to sit at this table, enough to vote, enough to decide leadership. Shock rippled through the room again. Board members who had dismissed him moments earlier now sat straighter, their eyes wide. The boss's mouth opened, then closed, his face red with rage. You can't. The man cut him off with calm finality. You framed me for theft. But the real theft was yours. And now, I don't just clear my name. I take back what you tried to steal. Control. The room erupted into discussion. Some members demanded answers from the boss. Others pointed at the evidence on the screen, shaking their heads. The balance of power shifted in a single moment. The boss slammed his fist on the table, shouting, but the louder he grew, the more desperate he looked. The man remained silent, letting the storm rage around him, his calmness stronger than any argument. Finally, the chairman of the board raised his hand, calling for order. His voice was stern, his eyes fixed on the boss. The evidence speaks for itself. The recommendation is not termination of this man, but removal of yours. Gasps filled the room as the words sank in. A vote was called. One by one, the hands went up, some reluctantly, some firmly. The result was clear. The boss had lost. The man had won. For the first time, the man allowed himself a small smile. Not of arrogance, but of quiet victory. He gathered his papers, closed his folder, and stood. His eyes met his boss's, who sat stunned, pale, defeated. He spoke softly, but his words cut sharper than any shout. You thought lies would destroy me, but the truth destroyed you. Then he walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the echoes of whispers, the broken pride of his boss, and the knowledge that silence, patience, and truth had turned the game in his favor.